vegne av PRIO, NORAD og den globale scenen. Veldig fint å se så mange her som interessert i global governance, multilateralisme, og hvordan verden skal skrus sammen på en bedre måte for å løse dagens mange kriser. Dette blir det siste jeg sier på norsk, for dette arrangementet skal foregå på engelsk. Welcome to this event where we desperately search for hope. And not only that, we also search for concrete solutions. We're facing difficult times with a big war in the neighborhood, other devastating conflicts, climate crisis, extreme weather, global health issues, increasing poverty, increasing inequality, migration, you name it. And as illustrated in last year's Human Development Report by UNDP, young people don't really believe in the future anymore. Times are so uncertain, they don't believe in progress. The need for international cooperation is greater than ever. At the same time, countries, state leaders, and common people around the world seem to be losing faith in the UN, the World Bank Group, and other multilateral organizations. Maybe this is because the systems created in the 40s, 50s, and 60s are a little bit outdated, not capable of dealing effectively with the multiple crises of today. Maybe it's because more and more countries are moving in a nationalistic direction. Authoritarian leaders are tightening the grip, rights are reversed, democracies are declining. Or maybe it's because the governance structures, the power balance in these 70 to 80 years old institutions or these systems is not really fair. My name is Nina Bull Jørgensen, and unfortunately I don't have the answers. But hopefully you do, Your Excellency, Stefan Löfven. Please take the floor. A brief introduction. We all know you as the Prime Minister of Sweden for 7 years, from 2014 to 21.
Yep.
The last year, you've been busy working on even bigger things, I would say. Commissioned by the UN Secretary General, you have led something called the High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. The assignment was to identify concrete and feasible actions to support a radical shift in the international cooperation for the world to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. Nothing less.
Nothing less.
The result is a report called A Breakthrough for People and Planet. This is also the headline of this event. But actually last night I was thinking of a better headline for this event. What about Stefan Löfven, make multilateralism great again?
Oh no. A bit too much.
Please let us know how you plan to do that.
Nothing else? Now, first, thank you so much for this opportunity to be here today, and thank you, Priya and Norad, for arranging this. It's extremely important now, and if it's anything I want you to remember, think about after this, is that we need to gather under the UN flag now. This is the moment to gather under the UN flag. UN, with all its of course, it's not a perfect organization, but it's us as members, Norway, Sweden, US, whatever. We are the members, and we are responsible for making sure that UN works. So that is why I said yes to this. First, I thought it was impossible, but when the Secretary General calls, you say yes, and you do whatever you can. So I'm going to give you a brief description of the report, part of the report, because time is too short. So I want first to give you the context, why did we do this job, and then some of its content, and mostly on multilateral financial architecture, because whatever we need to do, we need a lot more investments in the world. And one thing that I also want you to remember is that we do not lack resources in the world. That's not the problem. The problem is how we spread the resources. That's the problem. We have enough to solve the problems we need to solve. Just make sure it happens. First, the context. If you remember, when the United Nations was 75 years, we had a pandemic, so it was quite a different celebration. But the General Assembly asked the Secretary General, we want you to come back with a kind of a statement of the state of the world and what we need to do now to tackle the climate crisis and the conflicts and whatever it is. So he came back a year later in September 2021 with a report by the name of Our Common Agenda, where he describes what he sees in this world and what needs to be corrected. And he summarized in one way using a phrase, now we are at a point where it is a breakthrough or a breakdown, the world. It's that serious. And now, this summer we just talked about the warm weather in Greece, but we have seen it all over. So there is something going on. More people need to see it. Just that issue is so important. And then after that, UN decided to organize a summit of the future. Originally, it was planned this year, but it was postponed to 2024. There is a summit of the future. And our report is one of the processes leading up to that. So because we want to hand over to the member states proposals that we think they should decide upon. That is important for this to work. So in this preparation, we, High-Level Advisory Board, we are one of, let's say, 9-10 different processes. One is a peace agenda, one is Global Digital Compact, and there is a lot of leading up to Summit of the Future next year. So right now, discussions are ongoing. There's a ministerial in New York now in September, where member states are supposed to decide upon the structure for this Summit of the Future and the headlines and so on. So that is the takeoff, and the Secretary General told us, be bold and be concrete. And we know what we need to do. We have the Paris Agreement, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and so on. So we know what to do. Tell us how to do this better. So we constantly, during 1 year, we asked how can we be concrete? I want to show you this because there has been, not least among G77 countries, a worry that our work is somehow interfering with the SDGs and other ongoing processes. And so we said, no, everything we say in this report need to support the sustainable goals, the development goals, support the Paris Agreement and so on. And this is one way of showing that all these, you see, on the left side there you have shifts, because we said we need to show shifts. This is not just small minor changes that need to be done. We're talking big changes. So we're talking shifts. And all those are connected to, I think it's 15 or something of the SDGs. So that is one way of showing that. So the question is how? We, among all these shifts, I'm going to say something about number one, but mostly on number three, global finance. And because we think it's important to rebuild trust in the multilateral system, that we can do things together, but we need to do it differently. And because of that, we propose 10 principles for the multilateral system. For example, it needs to be more people-centered. We work too much in silos in the UN system. One is doing that, one is doing that, one is doing that, instead of targeting focus on what needs to be done, and then you gather the different resources, different people that can make this work. But we also need it to be resourced. You can't have a system that isn't resourced enough. And that is why now I'm moving over quickly to number 3, the global financial architecture. We are now also following the discussions, and we see there is quite a lot of support on our proposals, and I will now say a few words about number 3. What does it mean? First, we say we need to repurpose the multilateral financial architecture, not least the development bank system. Be much more clearer on its ambitions, their mandates, need to include also poverty alleviation, but also, of course, shared prosperity, and financing global public goods. So if you broaden and make the mandate clearer, that gives also the development banks another possibility of using its resources. We also say that we need to make the private financing more accessible. So as I said, our problem is not the resources. The amount of resources in the world are huge. But we need 5 to 10, I hear different figures, we need $5 to $10 trillion every year now, adding to what we do now to make this work. And that requires also private. So if we can make sure that the World Bank, the IMF and others, our common resources, can handle risks in another way, it will attract more private money, and we will need more private money. So that is why we're also talking about coordinating and de-risking activities. If we can de-risk or at least risk share more, that will mean that we'll have more private money. Another proposal is to the SDR, the special drawing rights. It's like a asset reserve, you can say, it's lying there. But these reserves are most allocated to already rich countries, to the richer part of the world. And the poorer part of the world gets very little of this money. So we say, let's use those to make sure that the poorest part of the world can get access. We're talking about $500 billion US. It's a lot of money. And it's not so smart, to put it mildly, to put those reserves aside, not use them, and when we use them in the richer part of the world instead of making sure that the poorer part. That's another proposal. A third one is the governance changes. You know, we have just to appoint the top person in the World Bank and the IMF. In the World Bank, it's always an American. In the International Monetary Fund, it's always a European. And the voting system in these organizations are not so democratic. It is time for the richer part of the world, us, to make sure that the poorer part gets more of a saying. We need to be more democratic. We cannot build trust around the globe if we don't show trust, if we don't give other countries, the poorer part of the world, much more of a saying in these discussions. There's no doubt, and I've been witnessing now for years, and not least this last year, that the gap of trust between North and South, or developed and developing, or whatever we call ourselves, is widening and widening and widening, and that's a huge risk. I think we have a huge responsibility as the richer part to make sure that we close that gap as much as possible. So we are also proposing changes in the democratic system within this. Another point that we're making is the debt architecture. We have countries that are very, very close to going bankrupt, and more countries getting closer to that situation. We need a way of solving that, because we will never be able to do what we need to do in terms of climate and other issues if we don't make sure that they have a better financial situation. So one way of doing that is using something called swaps, that we can take away that debt if you, on the other hand, if you use that space investing in climate or investing in something else that will help this country develop in a right way. That is one way of doing it. There are other ways, of course, but we also need a framework to improve debt transparency. As you know, China and others, when they invest in Africa, it is connected with an increased debt. But we don't really know what it is, how much it is, and what it is connected to, what conditions or so. Yet another field on this financial is to pursue global taxation system. We need something, not a global tax system for everybody to adapt to, but we need to coordinate better. Just the fact that I would say it's quite common in the richer part of the world that those with the highest income pay the least tax. It's not so smart. We have a lot of money that we can use, and we need to make sure at least that everybody pays tax, that you contribute. And that means that we need to be better in coordinating so that money is not transferred from one country to another just to avoid tax. So we need to be better at coordinating that. Those are some of the examples of the financial system that I wanted to say, to mention, and I will summarize with saying that what now is needed, that if we think those are good proposals, we need to really push for them now. So we need to push our governments, because at the end of the day, it's the governments that will instruct the representatives in New York, the UN ambassadors, how to vote, how to act, how to argue. So please, if you think this is good, push for it and make sure that not only governments but also NGOs, that people in general we need people in general to talk about the necessity, the need of a change, the need of shifts, so that we can take on the climate issue, the peace issue, and the health issue, not least. And we can do this. This is basically not rocket science. It's just that we need to come together and, again, do that under the UN flag. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan Löfven. Definitely bold and concrete. I'm so happy to introduce to you an eminent panel who will comment on the recommendations that you presented. Anne-Marie Helland, Director of International Development at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Please have a seat. Simon Reed-Henry, Professor of Historical and Political Geography and researcher at PRIO, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. And then my own boss, Bård Vegar Solhjell, Director of NORAD. Please have a seat. So as you've heard, well, could we please still keep the slide that was there? There are suggested six radical shifts, but we are focusing on rebuilding trust in multilateralism and shift 3, global finance. And I would like to start with you, Anne-Marie Helland. Besides being in PwC, you are member of the government's expert group on how to arrange Norwegian aid smarter and more effectively. The report Investments in a Common Future was launched May this year. How does this report correspond to the vision of Löfven and his advisory board?
It corresponds very well. I think the underlying analysis is very much the same, that we are in a fragmented world and that the problems or the challenges we're facing are much bigger than what individual countries are able to solve on their own. I mean, and that's sort of the big shift that we see, that the major challenges that we faced even over the past 5 to 10 years, I mean, the global climate crisis, the global pandemic, there are obvious examples that this cannot be solved by one country alone, and which means that we need cooperation, and we need effective cooperation where the different actors and countries are contributing sort of on a level playing field, so we are able to harvest all of the experiences and all of the knowledge that is out there, and that it's coordinated and led. And I think we talked a lot in the expert group about also the normative role of the UN, how important that is now. I mean, to really look at what is it the UN has that no other actor globally can actually contribute. I mean, look at the human rights agenda, democracy, peace, all of these things where the UN has to have a stronger voice and has to be financed and enabled to actually contribute on that.
And the expert group also suggested a kind of new division of the aid in 2 or 3 different categories.
2 categories, because we still, I mean, the geography of like climate emissions and poverty is very different. I mean, you see that, you know, the poorest of the poor have you know, they have no influence on the emissions that we are letting out. So we have said that we need to do both, and that we should have a division in, especially Norwegian development aid, but in general, where you have something earmarked for poverty reduction, where you actually go on the poorest countries, the poorest of the poor, the extreme poor, humanitarian aid, and that needs to be safeguarded, because otherwise the Ukraine war, the climate crisis will slowly eat off of the cake of the poorest, and that is happening now. I mean, many people are saying that Malawi is paying for Ukraine, or Central African Republic is paying for climate change, because you take it out of the development aid budget. But then we have a separate category which is equally important, and that is for the global common goods. And we need also to earmark or to sort of have allocated funds for that. But it's about bringing clarity, as you were saying again. We need clarity on what is it that we're doing and who are doing what best.
Mm. Thank you. I also recall you emphasizing on private sector and the need to spur investments of private sector, which you mentioned. Simon Reed Henry, besides being a researcher in PRIO, or along with that, you lead something called the Global Public Investment Network, an international network of organizations with radical new proposals for financing global common needs. How will you put yourself, what piece of the puzzle are you filling in here?
Thanks, Nina. Yes, well, I mean, in a sense, the Global Public Investment Network is one of the NGOs, the people's voice that you referred to. And I think it is important to have that. Also, to build a little on what Anne-Marie was saying, listening to the expert group's report and the proposals being put forward for how one country, Norway, might be able to move towards a system whereby we also find financing for some of the common challenges we have, the challenges that I think you mentioned, Nina, we didn't have in the 1940s and 1950s in the same way when the current architecture was put together, is really key. And it's really key after the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, and it's become even more key after the pandemic. And what we require really is what we've been calling for a long time. You, as I say, focused on the Norwegian picture. From the Global Public Investment Network side, we've been calling for many years for doing this across all countries. And one of the distinctions that I would draw between our proposal for global public investment as one of the ways that we can achieve some of the reform proposals that Stefan Löfven put forward, and I really would encourage all of you to read the report, because it's refreshing reading in a context of an international debate that so often focuses on the problem and doesn't focus often enough on the solution. And you come with solutions and people say, well, that's just, it's not realistic. And the answer to that is, well, we'll show you the how. And global public investment is the how for some of this. Not all of it. We need private finance, you mentioned. But there's an element of public finance that we need to be able to put forward. The market-shaping value of public finance for setting things in motion, for being able democratically to decide what things as a global community under the UN, as you say, we need to focus on, that needs to come from somewhere, and we don't yet have that somewhere. So what we need and what we are calling for is a system a little bit like the system of ODA that we have, but built upon it, not in any way undermining it, additional, very much like the 0.3 that you would propose adding to a 0.7 that can go to these global common challenges. And then we need to have a governance arrangement around that. And I think this is one of the most important things that comes out of the Breakthrough for People and Planet report. We don't just need more money, we do need more money. 2.5 trillion funding gap each year for the SDGs before the pandemic. We do need more money, but we need better money. And what is better money? Better money is surely money that is generated from everybody, it's democratic. There's no reason why just a few wealthy countries should contribute to international financing agendas. No reason at all. You take the Act A, which was the system by which we decided to establish to try to finance vaccine provision and supply. 83% of that was financed by the G7. Just 1% was financed by all of the upper middle income countries. Now there's a lot of wealth in those countries, and those countries would be quite possibly very interested in putting some of that wealth to global agendas, but they won't do so until there's a structure in which they can also have some of the decision-making power over how it's used. And that's what we're calling for, not just more money, but better money in a new international governance arrangement for how we can manage these very important top-level funding lines established through budget lines in all countries. Burkina Faso contributes to the Global Fund. It's not impossible to do, but we don't have the system by which we can manage it. And that's what we need to build. That's what the Summit of the Future provides an opportunity to do.
I would like you to comment, Bård Vegar. One of the first things you did as the new director of NORAD was to initiate the project Development Aid Cooperation towards 2030, which, among others, resulted in a report advocating for a clear distinction between the more traditional aid and investments in global public goods, such as climate, global health, digital development, and aid related to migration. This report was launched in September 2021. Please explain how the main message of this report is linked to what you've heard so far from the other panelists.
Yeah. If you also just allow me to say on behalf of myself and Norad, again, welcome. It's a great honor, really, to have former Prime Minister Löfven here. And also, actually, we've been working closely with Sweden. The project you mentioned, Rethinking Development, evolved into a common project between SIDA, where I know your friend Karin Jämtin was the leader, also now a good friend of mine.
Yeah.
And we've been working together actually to look closer into many of the same issues that you presented in this report. And one of the reasons why we wanted to invite you was, of course, that I think that this report kind of plays quite well into the global debate and the need for more transformative change that we see now. And also the Norwegian expert group, in my view, does that. Because there are periods when, stability and just building on what we've done and making sure we have progress is the right way to think. Now there are more fundamental challenges, which is, I think, we have to address in different ways. And those, I would put them in three categories. First, the fact that, we have behind us a generation of immense social and economic progress. That has actually changed now. Changed before COVID, but COVID made a huge impression. Now we see many social and economic challenges going the wrong direction, especially in the poorest countries. Mm-hmm. Second, of course, the climate change and other public goods, mostly climate change, because climate change is fundamentally different from other challenges. We can only solve it if we solve it together. Because we have to make the emissions go to zero, and we totally depend on each other in somewhat different ways. And there are other. The pandemic is, of course, a somewhat similar challenge. That's number two. But I would also add the backsliding in democracy and political and civil liberties, which is also, after decades of progress, really. So I think this challenges the global system in ways that I wouldn't have, thought about 10 years or 20 years ago. And that was also what we started to look at in that project. and specifically the fact that, on the one hand, there's a financing need for social and economic development in the poorest countries, like Anne-Marie talked about. But at the same time, there are more global needs where we should think of a system where we all have to contribute to financing. And how do we address the fact that today these are all financed from the same budget? And for Norway and Sweden, it's been in the same situation where the 1% has become it's become the ceiling rather, instead of the floor for financing, and more challenges, global challenges, also that were in our own interest, were financed within that. And when I look at Cyril F. Johnson and Löfven's report, and I've read, of course, the expert group also, I see that a lot of the thinking is pretty much aligned to what we've developed in NORAD as ideas. Of course, all of these are ideas, these are proposals from technical experts and so on. The challenge is political.
Yeah.
Always. I guess we'll return to that.
But it seems like there are several forces pulling and pushing in the same direction. So the question now, the agenda is still huge and complex. You have recommended very concrete actions, but still, where to start? What should be the very first concrete action? Tax reform, some new debt architecture, more seats around the table. What is the very first, most urgent action?
First, the very urgent is to start right now, today, tomorrow, to start pushing for all these ideas. Because as I said, at the end of the day, it'll be the representatives, the permanent representatives in New York who will negotiate, and they get their instruction from their governments. So we need a real public power to say we want this change, we need this change. I think you're right, though, that there is so many things are going in the wrong direction, but I can hear still that more and more leaders also are aware of we need to do something, not least because G77 and others are very, very strong in their voice now. And I think the financing is the most important, and I think we also need a shift in our mentality, because many people think, well, we're giving away money. We're giving away. Why do we give away money? Why don't we keep them in our country so that we can do that and that and that? This is not giving away. This is investments. If you look at China, and I'm not saluting China's system, but it is a fact that some 200-300 people were lifted out of poverty into some kind of middle class. That's good for them as individuals, but it also affects the country, and it affects the world, because when they can be more active in the economy, and with our economies, not China, Norway specifically, but the economies in the world are very connected to one another. So that is something that will spread. And if you now look at Africa, the African continent is the continent that will grow in terms of population this coming century. So I think they will reach some 3.5-4 billion people at the end of this century. So that is an asset as well. If African countries can grow and develop in the way that we want them out of solidarity, it also will influence the world economy in a positive way. So there will be returns also for richer countries. So I think investment instead of just giving away money. I think that's crucial.
Simon Reed Henry, I would like to ask you, or actually ask you all, but about global finance. Do you see a kind of slow reform, transformation, or a revolution? Do we need something completely new?
Well, we can but hope for a revolution, perhaps. But the way to do it, as I think, as has been set out, we need to build institutionally towards enabling these things that I think there's a huge amount of agreement upon, and a lot of what we've spoken about today in the critical literature. So I'm a researcher at PRIO as well. You know, this is not controversial. We know that we need something like this. The question is, how do we put it together? And for that, we need a forum. We need mobilization of public voice. You mentioned it before. You go to any replenishment moment for any of the funds, the climate funds, the health funds, it's driven by public mobilization through the NGO sector and through others. That's how we bring about the changes. So that's a multi-level process. It needs education, it needs transformation of the debate, but it has to start with a dialogue at the international scale, which we can have through the Summit of the Future next year. We can initiate that gives us something, some roadmap, some pathway towards a future moment, 2030. You know, we've had the MDGs from 2000 to 2015. We've then had the SDGs now. What are we going to do after that? We can't just continue to set ourselves goals. We need to think about the systems and the structures by which we do that. And that, I think, is where we begin to implement the financial piece, which I absolutely agree is itself the starting point.
Anne-Marie.
Yeah, just to pick up on what Mr. Löfven said, I very much agree. And of course, the expert group report was called Investing in a Common Future. And that's exactly, we need to move beyond the whole give away money aspect. And I think that's has also something to do with how we frame the need for finances, because how do we get private sector on board? That's not by saying that you have to give away a whole lot of money, because that's not the way to do it. But you have to say this is an opportunity for investment. Exactly. And you need to allow private sector to actually earn money on it. But then that means we need to use aid smarter to make sure that there are taxation systems in place so that they pay their taxes, that there are labor rights in place so that workers who are employed actually have fair conditions to work. Because that's the way to get economic activity. And I think we tend to believe that private sector contribution into the SDGs is to be Bill Gates and just give away money. But that's philanthropy. And that's not going to cover the needs that we have. We have to have a system whereby you actually have genuine investments. And I also very much agree with what you said about risk minimization, I would say, or risk sharing, because investors in particular, they're experts on risk. So they don't need zero risk, but they're experts on actually calculating how much risk is worth taking. And if it goes beyond that, they would say no. But make sure that we have a risk sharing that makes the risk level acceptable, and you will have the investors on board.
Bård Vegar.
To start with the hopeful bit, I think that there's a growing understanding and that there's a need for change in the financial architecture, and that there's need for more financing. I think the global food crisis now is showing that both rich countries and developing countries see it more clearly, address it. The International Development Bank system is, there's a lot more criticism and debate on how that should develop, and partly along those lines. A new report this summer, which the Indian G20 chairmanship ordered. And also, I would add the global taxation debate, which is moving in the right direction, where there are, at least there are real efforts to move forward. The biggest challenge, the way I see it now, is that at the same time that the needs are bigger, and also there's at least tendency to this kind of debate, there's pressure on aid budgets and on the private sector back home. So the private sector investments to the poorest countries haven't gone up; they've gone down the last few years, which is in a way understandable. Also, of course, because companies take less risk in a situation which we've had the last few years. If you look at aid budgets, a shallow look can lead you to believe that they went up the last year with 14%. If you take away Ukraine and refugee costs, they went down, and especially to the poorest countries. And of course, in a situation with a totally understandable need to invest in defense and with high rising living costs, there's also pressure on prioritizing important issues in their own country, in Western countries. So that's where I see the real big political challenge.
Also, in a different new kind of Cold War dynamics, new geopolitical situations. I would like to ask you, Löfven, you were a head of state. What kind of diplomatic skills would it take to get other leaders on board, let's say from unlike-minded countries like Hungary, Uganda, Russia, China, and so on?
Mm-hmm.
What is your trick from the inside, from the corridors?
It's again about mentality. First, gather all the good forces. There are a lot of good forces. Gather the good forces, and then also talk to these countries' leaders about the win-win. It's a win-win, and that's what we need to achieve. And we can only, the pandemic was a clear example where we succeeded in developing a vaccine. That went well and fast. I was very glad but surprised that we could get the first shot a year after the outbreak of the pandemic. But then, distributing the vaccines, we failed. And I had numerous of phone calls with other leaders, EU and others, about this is not rocket science. We could have sat down around the table. We need, of course, everybody to have a voice, but start at least US, India, China, UK, EU, and that actually produce the vaccine. Not only produce it, make sure you know how much, make sure you know how to distribute it around the world, make sure you know how to train and educate people that need this to being able to give a shot. That would be the logistics that we could have done, but we didn't. That's a failure, and I think, again, it's an example. If we had done this together, that would also have been a win for these countries, because everybody was afraid of the pandemic. We said, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. Okay, so we said that, but we didn't act according to it, but we can do that. So, and other examples are, I think, the same. So shifting from this to win-win. And it's a way of building common security. It's a good thing for them to turn to their own people and say, hey, this international cooperation is very good for us as well. This is something that we are gaining from because we're building common security. And common security is much better than, I fully agree with you. Right now we have to put a lot of resources into arms and military equipment. That's a necessity now. But in the long term, the best security that we can provide people is building trust between countries. And one way of doing that is handling the pandemic better, making sure that the developing countries can develop better. And we should say to China, US, okay, you're competing now. Fine, we understand that. But you need to do this in a way that doesn't end up in a military conflict. And one way of doing it is to build trust between your countries and do so by taking a lead now in making sure that the African continent can actually develop in a way that would benefit all of us. That's your responsibility.
Thank you for giving us hope and going towards the end of this event. Unfortunately, time is short, but we're heading towards a kind of positive note. I would like to give you all 30 seconds each to finalize. What are your hopes for global governance and multilateralism?
That we are able to both finance and to give ample power to the normative forces of the UN system, because I believe that's really what we need. We need that someone to lead the way, and I think the UN system is currently the structure who can do that.
Simon Reed-Henry.
Yeah, well, let me build on that. I mean, I think it has to begin with changing the narrative, investment rather than giving money away, but also recognizing that countries have a self-interest in contributing to some of these things that they don't yet do. And there are common returns from all of those, but we need to show that. We need to do the sort of research we do at PRIO. We need to put numbers on it. and then we need to take that out and create new narratives and new stories around it. And I think very much that's kind of what the expert group's report pushes us to, and it's the kind of work that Rethinking Development is pushing us towards. So I see room for hope, but I think we need to step up the discussion. You know, it won't happen by its end, and we can't wait to the good times. You know.
I'll give you the last words.
So the first recommendation is to rebuild trust in multilateralism. But anyone who's been a politician or even a leader of anything knows that you can't just decide to rebuild trust. It's like, okay, trust. Anyone in favor? The best thing you can do is to deliver. You know, to make a real effort so that people think you deserve their trust. And right now, I think the multilateral system isn't delivering well enough. I mean. And so we have to challenge ourselves, the finance part, but not only that, other parts of it as well, our ability to agree goals and actually push for them and so on. And I think this, like the other efforts here, they are about that. How do we do the necessary changes and also scaling up finance to actually deliver better so that we deserve trust?
And Bård Vegar, I would like you to repeat what you said yesterday. Bård Vegar Solhjell had a round-the-world trip explaining climate change and how that affects different countries in the world. And you said something about cooperation and the instinct in human beings.
I didn't actually go around the world. I just had a talk here, 45 minutes. No, I mean, it's something people tend to speak about human natures like we're all egoists and think about ourselves. But modern research in biology and archaeology and psychology and so on tends to show the opposite. That what defines us as humans is our ability to cooperate, complex cooperation. It's sometimes called. For instance, humans we're the only species with the ability to have altruism, to actually do something that's in the interest of others without it being in the interest of ourselves. And a Norwegian author and biologist called Dag Hesten has written a book called We, where he kind of sets out how human nature has it in it to cooperate on solution. And I think that's also what we see historically. Wars, pandemics, extreme ideologies, when it's important, we have it in ourselves to solve problems we created and cooperate on solutions. So that's why I call myself an empirical optimist sometimes.
Yeah. And with those words, thank you so much, Your Excellency, Stefan Löfven, Anne-Marie Helland, Simon Reed Henry, and Bård Vegar Solhjell. Jeg synes det var så fint, at det var verdt å ta på nytt.